Okay.
I believe, if I could suggest, that Attorney General Mills is here to update you on a conversation that she had with the USTR. Is that right?
Yep. Good.
That's all right.
Get your chair.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Janet Mills, Attorney General for the State of Maine. I'm also the Tobacco Co-Chair for the National Association of Attorneys General. And in that capacity and in other capacities, I've drafted a letter to the U.S. Trade Ambassador, Trade Representative, some months ago. That letter was circulated. We got 22 other Attorneys General. It was a fairly forceful letter. As I mentioned to you last meeting, word got out about that letter, and we started getting phone calls from the White House and phone calls from the Trade Representative, and began having phone conversations with him. We've had, I think, 3 phone conferences with him, and then a personal meeting, which I reported on at your last meeting. Attorney General Wasden, a Republican Attorney General from Idaho, and I met privately with Ambassador Froman and a couple of his staff. Since then, we gave him the courtesy of a conference call with any other attorneys general or their staff who wanted to participate, and that happened just last Wednesday. There were 34 offices on the phone. I think only 3 other attorneys general, but I mean, from my point of view, it wasn't very fulfilling. It was obviously cordial, reassuring, but not very informative. We were concerned about transparency. We talked about that. He reassured us that they're committed to maximizing transparency, consistent with negotiating the best deal for the United States of America, that they have, in fact, published their negotiating goals, and they've engaged with Congress to a larger extent than any previous negotiators had done, and given Congress many briefings, and created the IGPAC, and publicized summaries of different versions of the negotiations. I wasn't particularly satisfied with that, and I asked him at one point, towards the end, we only had half an hour with him, I asked him what current version of the ISDS that they were putting forward, that the United States was putting forward. He didn't answer that. He said that the BTIP model was the starting point for ISDS and the starting point for defining expropriation and the prudential exception as defined in there. I pointed out that prudential exception does not include consumer protection of financial nature, and we were concerned about that. He reassured us, as he had in the one-on-one meeting, personal meeting, that the prudential exception, he believes, does include financial regulations. The footnote in the model BTIP talks about prudential exception and allowing for regulations to protect, and I can't remember the exact language, protect the stability of financial institutions. It does not address consumer protections such as those contained in our state laws and in federal laws and Dodd-Frank and whatnot. He said that they were they are extremely, those protections, predatory lending protections and whatnot, are extremely, he said, of extremely high importance to us. But I still have not seen the language that protects those interests. On tobacco, he again reassured us that it was a high priority to protect the authority of the FDA to regulate tobacco, and we all kind of chimed in and said, well, yeah, but there's this master settlement agreement in 1998, and that has got incredibly complicated provisions dealing with the state's authority to regulate all kinds of things dealing with tobacco. And I pointed out not just tobacco, but nicotine-related products like e-cigarettes. Many states, if not most states, are looking at regulating e-cigs. That's not a tobacco product per se, but it's a nicotine product. So we're concerned about that. We had a fairly free-flowing discussion for about a half an hour. And I brought up the recent decision from the WTO on country of origin labeling, which in which the WTO's Board of Appeals ruled against the restrictions regarding labeling of meat products and whatnot. He said, well, that wouldn't happen under he gave us the impression that that kind of ruling wouldn't happen under their negotiated proposals. Regardless, we still haven't seen the language. And I think I asked specifically what version of the ISDS they were negotiating for. Was it the version that was leaked by WikiLeaks or some other version? And he wasn't specific in his response. But the good thing that happened was we proposed that their negotiators get together with our tobacco experts at the National Association of Attorneys General, housed in Washington, D.C. And this past week they have done that. We want to make sure that the negotiators are really up to speed about the terms of the Master Settlement Agreement. As you know, a year plus ago, we sent a letter to the trade ambassador asking for tobacco carve-out. Instead, they have the language that relates to health, safety, and welfare regulations. I'm not sure that covers things like regulation of e-cigs, because e-cigs, the health, welfare, safety aspects of e-cigarettes, for instance, are hotly debated. And one country may say that you can't regulate it because e-cigs are good for people who are weaning off of cigarettes and tobacco products. Other countries and other regulators and other AGs will say regulation of e-cigs is perfectly appropriate under the health, welfare, safety rubric, because they are weaning teenagers onto nicotine products unfairly and getting them addicted. So that debate's going on, and I said I don't think that language that you're talking about covers a lot of tobacco issues and nicotine issues. So they have sat down initially, and Ambassador Froman was part of the discussions this week with our tobacco staff in Washington to learn a lot more about the Master Settlement Agreement, and which gives most states an incredible amount of discretion and regulatory authority over tobacco, and of course provides a revenue stream to the state of Maine of more than $50 million a year. We're working hard to preserve that. So that's about the sum and substance of our discussion. Yesterday I proposed that we redraft the letter to reflect the recent meetings and conversations with the ambassador, and that we still send a letter for the public record reflecting our ongoing concerns.
So was it your opinion from your conversation that the state would not have any standing as far as how we regulate tobacco, or would we lose all that capability?
We wouldn't lose that capability, but we would be subject to, our regulations would be subject to lawsuit. And that's another thing that was brought up, an ongoing concern about what is the role of states if another country or another investor, calling them investors, offshore companies, bring a lawsuit. If a tobacco company has an offshore branch or they're domiciled offshore, they can bring a grievance, a complaint, before this Board of Arbitration, whatever they're going to call it, under ISDS, and suggest that the state of Maine's regulations, state of Vermont's regulations, whoever's, impact their ability to make a profit in our state, impact their ability to do business, and their unfair regulation and restraint of trade, essentially, against these foreign investors. So what is the state's role if and when they do that? And the view of the USTR is, well, that really isn't going to happen. We're just trying to bring up other countries' standards. We're not trying to lower our standards. And it's a difficult balance. Very sensitive thing. So we said, well, what is the role of the states? And I think I asked him this in person last month as well. We don't want to just be amicus curiae, and that's what the Model B tip says, amicus curiae. We can file a brief, friend of the court. No, it is our state regulations, and our legislature has passed these laws, and agencies pass these rules and regulations. Legislatures approve them. We want to be able to protect our authority, our ability to regulate in the interest of the health and safety of our citizens. He said, basically, I don't want to misquote him, but he said any money judgments would be paid from a federal judgment fund. He reassured us that the federal government would defend vigorously all cases brought, that they would minimize the burden on the states. They just want to raise the bar in the other countries. And I wasn't really satisfied with the answer, either in person or over the phone. Not that I want to take on a lot more litigation, but I want to be able to do my job and defend the state of Maine whenever appropriate.
Any questions for the Attorney General? Sharon?
On the letter, is that gonna be a public letter that we could see once it's sent?
You can see a draft anytime.
Okay, but
My stuff is public, but
when it is sent,
Oh,
is that
sure.
something that could be shared with our staff and could be
Sure.
shared with the commission?
of course, yep.
Great.
And I think I've shared with you before the letters we sent a year ago, February, and which we resent earlier this year regarding tobacco in particular. We asked for a tobacco carve-out. That hasn't happened. It's apparently not going to happen. That's not the position of the United States government.
If I could just make a comment on that, before the US was proposing this health welfare exception, which is basic standard language in all of these anyway, they did have a much more specific proposal that was offered not as a complete exclusion, but it was intended to protect tobacco regulation. And it wasn't exactly public, except that they had so many public meetings about it that you could be pretty clear about what it was. And in that, and I guess I'm saying this because I think it's a very good thing that you were meeting with the negotiators, it was only about FDA regulations. It said
Yeah.
absolutely nothing about laws.
Yeah.
Or state laws and regulations. It was purely about protecting the FDA's authority to do what they can do now, and not necessarily also protecting authority to do other kinds of things that aren't being done now. And so I think there's a real, I mean, they abandoned that language because it was criticized, but then they went back to something that in some ways is even weaker. But I think there's a real disconnect in terms of their understanding how tobacco, and actually many other things, like I mentioned insurance at our meeting earlier today, that there is a very strong role for state regulation that is not necessarily protected even when they're trying to protect it.
Yeah. And to be clear, the state of Maine, for instance, regulates fire safety, issues relating to tobacco, regulate purchases by minors, we regulate flavoring. So they're not out selling candy cigarettes, real cigarettes that are candied flavored, to appeal to kids, things like that. We have a tremendous amount of regulations that are authorized under the Master Settlement Agreement that the FDA does not do. They do have their own separate group or set of regulations.
Any other questions? Thank you for the
Thank you.
report.